The lights dimmed, and the camera zoomed in on the set of the Evening Spotlight, one of the most watched talk shows in the country. It was a typical night, but something felt different tonight. The air was charged with an unspoken tension. Sarah. Mitchell, the show's dynamic host, had been preparing for this interview for weeks. She was known for her sharp wit, her bold stance on social issues, and her no-holds-barred approach to interviewing Hollywood stars. And tonight, her guest was none other than Keanu Reeves. Keanu had always been known for his down-to-earth persona. The man who played iconic roles in films like The Matrix and John Wick was someone who kept his private life private and rarely stirred up controversy. But Sarah had a different idea. She wanted to challenge him. She wanted to push him out of his comfort zone and make him respond to the hard-hitting questions everyone was dying to know. As the show began, Sarah wasted no time. She dove straight into a topic that had been trending in the media, the growing wave of woke culture. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she asked, "Keanu, you've always been a man of principle, but some people argue that your views are, well, outdated. Do you think it's time for you to, perhaps, evolve with the times? What do you think of the current social movements?" Keanu smiled calmly, but there was an undeniable glint in his eyes. He wasn't one to shy away from questions, but the way Sarah framed this one, attacking his beliefs in a roundabout way, was something different. "Sarah," Keanu began, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of something sharper, "I think social movements are important. Change is necessary. But I also think that change needs to come with respect for people's individuality, for their freedom to think and express themselves in their own way." The words hung in the air. Sarah was quiet for a moment, clearly surprised by his composed response, but she wasn't backing down. "But don't you think some of your ideas might be considered problematic by today's standards? After all, there's so much happening in the world right now. You don't want to be left behind, do you?" The tension in the studio thickened. The crew shifted uncomfortably, aware that this was not just another typical celebrity interview. Sarah was pushing Keanu, challenging him in a way no one had done before. Keanu's expression remained unchanged, his calm demeanor only adding to the suspense in the room. He wasn't just responding to Sarah's question. He was getting ready to answer in a way that no one was expecting. "You know, Sarah," Keanu said, leaning forward just a bit, his gaze locked onto hers, "maybe it's not about being left behind, but about staying true to who you are. And that includes respecting the space to have conversations like this, without feeling like you have to say what others want you to say." The crowd fell silent. Sarah looked stunned. It was clear that Keanu had just delivered a subtle but powerful jab. The tension was palpable. "What do you think of Keanu's response? Would you have handled this situation the same way?" Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, because this conversation is only getting started. Keanu Reeves was more than just a Hollywood icon. He was an enigma. Unlike many of his peers who reveled in the spotlight, Keanu had always maintained a sense of humility and privacy that intrigued the public. His career spanned decades, and despite his immense success, he remained grounded, unshaken by the chaos of fame that surrounded him. Born in Beirut and raised in Toronto, Keanu's childhood was far from ordinary. His mother, a costume designer, and his father, who was absent from his life for most of his youth, shaped Keanu's worldview in ways that were both challenging and formative. His early years were marked by instability, moving from city to city, struggling with a fractured family life, and navigating the complexities of youth. His mother, though loving, was often his sole support, and Keanu learned early on how to rely on himself. These experiences shaped Keanu's personality, a man of few words but deep thought. He didn't crave attention. He didn't need validation. In fact, some of his most beloved qualities were rooted in his ability to remain humble, despite being one of the highest-paid actors in the world. But Keanu's humility didn't mean he was immune to the pressures of fame. He had faced immense personal tragedy, losing close family members and friends, including his beloved sister, who battled leukemia for years. His pain was private, but it was deep, and it fueled his resilience. Yet, despite all the hardships, Keanu never allowed the world to see him as a victim. Instead, he chose to focus on the positive, on giving back to the community, supporting charitable causes, and fostering an image of kindness and generosity. He wasn't just an actor. He was a man who deeply valued the relationships in his life. He understood that fame was fleeting, but the love and respect of those closest to him was something that lasted forever. Sarah Mitchell, on the other hand, was an entirely different character. At 32, she had risen to prominence through sheer force of will. Known for her directness and unapologetic views on social justice, Sarah had built a career around pushing boundaries. She wasn't afraid to ask the hard questions, to challenge her guests and to confront uncomfortable truths. But her rise to fame had come at a price. Her reputation was as divisive as it was respected. While many admired her for being bold and unafraid to speak out, others criticized her for what they saw as a tendency to force narratives, to make people answer to the pressures of modern political correctness. Sarah had a knack for getting under people's skin. Some guests walked away from her interviews angry, while others left in deep thought, questioning their own views. But what truly set Sarah apart was her commitment to pushing for change. She believed that society's problems weren't just things to talk about, they were issues to solve, and she wanted her platform to be the place where those solutions were discussed, no matter how controversial the conversation became. The clash between Keanu and Sarah was inevitable. She saw him as a symbol of the old guard, someone who hadn't quite caught up with the progressive tide of the modern world. He, in turn, saw Sarah's approach as rigid, even dismissive of the complexity of individual experience. Where Sarah wanted to force clarity and a sense of collective action, Keanu believed in personal autonomy and the right to hold differing opinions. As Sarah looked across the table at Keanu, she was well aware of his reputation. She knew that he wasn't someone who would back down easily, but she also felt a sense of excitement. This interview had the potential to be a defining moment in her career, a chance to challenge one of the most beloved actors in Hollywood. But little did she know Keanu was not about to give her what she expected. Keanu, in his own way, was about to take this conversation to a level neither of them anticipated. What do you think of Keanu's backstory? Does his past shape the way you see him today? Drop a comment below and don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay tuned for the rest of the interview. As Sarah Mitchell's questions became sharper, Keanu's composure remained unshaken. The studio audience could feel the tension building. What had started as a typical interview was quickly turning into a battle of wills. The conversation shifted. Sarah pressed harder, attempting to break through Keanu's calm exterior. She tilted her head slightly, leaning into the microphone, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. Keanu, I have to ask, do you ever feel like you've missed out on using your platform for something bigger? I mean, with all the attention you get, wouldn't you agree that there's a responsibility to be more vocal on issues like climate change, racial inequality, and gender rights? Keanu paused, taking a breath. The question was pointed, and it was exactly what Sarah had been building toward. She had tried to corner him with the idea that his silence on these hot-button topics made him complicit in the status quo. Keanu's lips twitched into a small smile. Sarah, he began, his tone as measured as ever, I think the responsibility of an individual isn't just about speaking on what's popular or trendy at the moment. It's about choosing to act where you feel you can make a real difference, and not just making noise. There was a brief silence. Sarah furrowed her brow, not expecting such a philosophical response. This was not the fiery, dismissive answer she had hoped to provoke. She pressed on. But isn't that the problem, Keanu? People like you, with so much influence, don't use your voice to challenge the system. You remain neutral, and in a time like this, isn't neutrality the same as complicity? The studio audience shifted in their seats. The question hit hard, and some people could already sense the direction this interview was headed. Sarah, the fierce advocate for progressive change, was pushing Keanu to answer for his perceived inactivity. She believed that by questioning his silence, she could reveal a deeper truth about him. But Keanu wasn't ready to be painted with a broad brush. I don't think it's about silence, Sarah. Keanu replied, his voice growing slightly more serious. It's about being authentic. There are a million causes that need attention, and every person has their own way of contributing. But not everyone needs to shout about their actions for them to be valid. A murmur ran through the crowd. Keanu's response was an echo of his long-held belief that action spoke louder than words. He had always been the type to act without fanfare, quietly donating to charities, helping those in need and supporting his community without expecting recognition. Yet, Sarah wasn't backing down. She leaned forward again, her voice sharper. Now, but isn't there a risk in keeping quiet? What about the people who don't have a voice? What about those who are marginalized, whose stories never get told because people like you refuse to speak up? Keanu's eyes met hers directly. He wasn't angry, but there was a palpable sense of resolve in his gaze. He took another deep breath before responding. I think it's dangerous to assume that silence equals indifference. Sometimes it's more powerful to listen, to understand. And when the time is right, then speak. The studio grew still. This was no longer just an interview. It was a philosophical debate about the role of celebrity, the responsibility of influence, and the meaning of activism. Sarah, though still confident in her convictions, was beginning to sense that this conversation wasn't going as she had planned. Keanu was dismantling her arguments, not with a dismissive rebuttal, but with calm, reasoned responses that made her question whether she truly understood the complexity of the issues she championed. For a moment, Sarah faltered. She wasn't used to this. Most of her interviews were with people who either nodded along to her views or at least accepted the premise of her questions. But Keanu was different. He wasn't just answering. He was challenging the very foundation of the conversation itself. It was a rare sight, a public figure, standing up not by raising their voice, but by lowering it. By speaking with quiet authority, Keanu was forcing Sarah to confront her own assumptions about what activism should look like. The tension was palpable. The audience was on the edge of their seats, sensing that this moment was about to shift into something much bigger than just a talk show debate. What do you think of Keanu's stance? Do you agree that sometimes silence is more powerful than speaking out? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for the rest of the interview. Trust us, you won't want to miss what happens next. As Sarah Mitchell sat back, she realized that the conversation had taken a turn she hadn't quite anticipated. Keanu's calmness was disarming, and in a way, it had thrown her off balance. But she wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. Sarah had an agenda, a story to tell, a narrative to push. She had carefully crafted this interview to reveal something that, in her mind, Keanu needed to be held accountable for. But Keanu was proving to be more elusive than she had imagined. After a brief pause, Sarah adjusted her approach. She leaned forward, a slight smile playing on her lips, as if she had a new angle in mind. I see your point, Keanu, she said, her voice softening, but her eyes sharp. But I have to ask, how do you reconcile that personal philosophy with your public image? I mean, let's be honest, you're one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. You've played these incredible roles, you've gained a massive following, and yet you still choose to keep a low profile. Why? Are you afraid of controversy? Or is it just easier to stay out of the conversation and let others do the work? Keanu's expression didn't change. He could see what she was doing, trying to provoke a response, trying to get him to reveal something more vulnerable, something that would make the audience question his intentions. But he wasn't about to fall into her trap. I think, Keanu began slowly, his voice still even, that there's a lot of noise in the world already. People are shouting, posting, commenting. All of it can be overwhelming. But I've always believed in the importance of action. Not in the spotlight, not in the headlines. I've worked with charities, supported people in need, and done what I can to give back. But I don't need anyone's approval to do it. Sarah raised an eyebrow. She could feel the subtle tension in his words. Keanu wasn't just talking about charity work. He was addressing the very essence of his public persona. It was a revelation she hadn't expected. He wasn't just avoiding controversy for the sake of comfort. He was deliberately keeping his distance from the spectacle of fame. Sarah, sensing an opening, pressed again. But don't you think that by not using your platform to speak out on issues that matter, you're complicit in the silence? You're choosing not to take a stand, and some people could argue that's a form of privilege. Keanu met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. I disagree, he said quietly. Choosing not to speak on certain topics doesn't mean I'm ignoring them. It means I'm thinking. Sometimes not having an opinion on something immediately is a form of respect. I'm not here to push my views on everyone. I'd rather listen, understand, and then act. Sarah felt a slight shift in the room. The energy in the studio had changed. The audience, once eagerly leaning forward, now appeared more contemplative. They were hearing something they hadn't expected from one of Hollywood's most famous figures: humility and restraint, qualities that seemed at odds with the media frenzy that often surrounded celebrities. But Sarah wasn't ready to back down. This wasn't how she envisioned the interview going. She needed to find a way to break him, to expose him as out of touch, or at the very least unwilling to confront the complexities of today's world. She leaned in again, her voice more insistent. I hear what you're saying, Keanu, but don't you think that by staying silent, you're letting others define your narrative for you? You've been labeled as the nice guy, the humble actor, but isn't there more to you than that? Do you ever feel the pressure to step up and speak out about things that are wrong? The world needs people like you to lead, not just stand by. Keanu sat back, the flicker of a smile crossing his face. It wasn't one of arrogance or frustration, but a quiet understanding. Sarah, I don't need to be the voice for every cause. I believe in empowering others to use their voices. Everyone has their own path, their own way of contributing. Some people lead with words, others with actions. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to activism, and I certainly don't believe in forcing people into boxes of what they should say or do. There was a palpable shift in the air. The audience seemed to resonate with the gravity. They of his words. Keanu had turned the tables again. Sarah, who had wanted to force him into a confrontation, now found herself in a position where she had to confront her own assumptions about what it meant to be an activist. The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of his response. It wasn't the answer she had wanted, but it was the answer Keanu believed in, and that, in its own way, was a form of resistance to the pressure that celebrities faced to conform to public expectations. Sarah, visibly taken aback, struggled to find her next words. The energy in the room had shifted, and the audience could feel it. Keanu had managed to stay true to himself, navigating her attempts to provoke him without faltering. And for the first time, Sarah realized that this interview wasn't just about uncovering something hidden within Keanu Reeves. It was about uncovering something within herself. What do you think? Is Keanu right about letting actions speak louder than words? Or do you think celebrities should be more vocal on social issues? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. There's more to come. And it's only getting more intense. The studio was quiet, almost eerily so. The usual hum of chatter had died down, and the tension that had been building throughout the interview was now thick, almost tangible. Sarah Mitchell sat there, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk, as she tried to process the conversation that was unfolding before her. Keanu Reeves had once again turned the tables. She had asked him hard questions, tried to force him into a corner, but every time he answered with calm and dignity, staying true to his values. It was almost as if he was deliberately refusing to fit into the mold that Sarah had so carefully set out for him. His words weren't just responses, they were challenges, challenges to her perspective, her worldview, and even the role that celebrities like him were supposed to play in shaping public discourse. And now, for the first time in the interview, Sarah could feel a flicker of doubt in her own mind. Was she being too harsh? Was she expecting something from Keanu that wasn't fair or even realistic? She had prided herself on being the bold interviewer, the one who dug deep and got answers that others didn't have the courage to ask. But right now she couldn't help but wonder if Keanu was teaching her something that she hadn't considered before. But she quickly pushed that thought aside. This was her show. She was in control, and she couldn't afford to let him get away with sidestepping the bigger questions. She leaned forward again, her gaze steady. "Keanu," she said, her voice colder now, as if she was trying to regain her footing. "I have to ask, if you truly believe in letting others speak out, why haven't you used your voice in a way that could push this conversation further? You have the power to make a difference, and yet you choose to remain in the background. Do you ever regret that?" Keanu didn't flinch. He simply met her eyes with that calm, almost serene look that had become his trademark. The answer he gave was simple but profound. "I don't regret anything," he said softly. "I've never seen my silence as a failure to act. I've always believed that the best way to lead is by example. Sometimes people need to see you make the right choices, even if it's quietly. They don't need to hear you talk about it. They need to see it in what you do." Sarah couldn't help herself. The question that had been simmering in her mind finally slipped out. "But isn't that a cop-out to say that leading by example is enough? Isn't that just avoiding the uncomfortable truths that come with being in the public eye? People are suffering, Keanu, and we need leaders who are willing to speak out, to challenge the system. You're just hiding behind your actions while the world burns." For a brief moment, Keanu's eyes darkened, just a flicker of something deeper passing through them. But he didn't respond immediately. He sat there watching her, letting her words hang in the air. Sarah could feel the shift in energy. This wasn't just an argument about social issues anymore. It was something more personal, more emotional. Then, with a sigh, Keanu spoke again, his voice low and steady, but this time there was a steeliness in his tone. "I don't see it as hiding, Sarah. I see it as respecting the complexity of life. The world isn't black and white. I don't pretend to have all the answers, and I don't think anyone else does either." The audience was hanging on every word now. There was something raw in the way Keanu spoke, not just about activism, but about life itself. The pain and depth in his voice were palpable, and for the first time in the interview, Sarah realized that she wasn't just debating him on issues of social justice or celebrity culture. She was confronting a man who had lived through real tragedy, who had faced life's hardest challenges, and who wasn't willing to reduce everything to sound bites or easy answers. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "You want me to speak out, Sarah, but I think that's a convenient way to avoid asking the deeper questions, the ones about why we do what we do and what's really driving all this noise. People speak out all the time, but does that make them leaders, or does it just make them loud?" There it was, the twist that Sarah hadn't seen coming. In her drive to make Keanu confront the issues she cared so deeply about, she had overlooked the depth of his perspective. He wasn't avoiding the conversation. He was calling her to a higher level of discourse, one where the easy answers weren't enough. Sarah was silent for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time in the interview, she wasn't just the interviewer. She was the one being challenged. The silence was broken by the sound of the audience, exhaling, as if they had all been holding their breath. Sarah was still processing, but she knew she couldn't let the interview end like this, not without trying to regain control. But as she opened her mouth to speak, Keanu raised a hand gently, signaling that he wasn't done. "I'll say it again," he continued, his voice quieter now. "Sometimes speaking out is important, but sometimes action is louder. I think what people need is a reminder that they have their own power, their own ability to make change. Not everyone is going to do it the same way. But the moment you start judging others for how they choose to act, you're losing sight of what really matters." The studio was absolutely still. The crew, the audience, everyone felt the impact of his words. Keanu had not only answered Sarah's questions, he had turned the entire conversation on its head. For the first time in the interview, Sarah didn't have a quick retort. There was nothing more to say, at least nothing that would come close to the power of Keanu's words. Keanu's words are powerful, but do you agree with him? Is action more important than words when it comes to making change? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The interview is far from over, and trust us, it's only going to get more intense from here. Sarah Mitchell sat back in her chair, the weight of the conversation settling in. It wasn't just that Keanu had turned the tables, it was that he had made her rethink her own approach to activism, to fame, and to the complex world of social justice. She had come into this interview with one goal: to challenge him, to force him to respond to the expectations that the world had placed on him. But Keanu, as always, had approached the situation with a calmness that made her questions seem almost insignificant. For a moment, she simply stared at him. She wasn't sure what to say next. The interview had taken a turn into deeper waters than she had anticipated. She had asked tough questions, tried to push him into a corner, but instead of faltering, he had offered something far more profound. The idea that silence wasn't always complicit, and that action sometimes spoke louder than words. It was clear that Keanu wasn't just a man of few words, he was a man of deeply held beliefs. And as Sarah sat there facing him, she started to realize that this wasn't just an interview anymore. It had become something much more personal, not just for her, but for everyone watching. This was a moment of vulnerability, one that forced her to examine her own perceptions. Keanu, noticing her pause, broke the silence. His voice was softer this time, more reflective. "You know, Sarah," he said quietly, "it's easy to forget that the real struggle isn't about being seen or heard. It's about the choices we make in our everyday lives, the way we treat people, the way we show up for those who need us most. There's no camera, no applause for those moments. But those moments, they matter. And I think we all need to focus on that a little more." There was a gentle sincerity in his voice that made Sarah's chest tighten. She had spent so much of her life chasing headlines, pursuing stories that would get people talking. But in that instant, she began to wonder. Was she missing something important? Was she so focused on the loudness of activism that she was overlooking the quieter, more profound ways that people could make a difference? Keanu's words hung in the air like a subtle yet heavy truth. "I'm not saying we should all be silent," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "But we have to ask ourselves why we speak. Are we speaking for ourselves, or are we speaking for those who can't? Are we speaking because it's the right thing to do, or because it's what's expected of us?" The gravity of his questions struck Sarah deeply. She felt as if she had been pushed to confront her own motivations. Why did she question him so fiercely? Was it because she was genuinely concerned about his inaction, or was it because she wanted him to confirm her own worldview? The worldview that said celebrity activism was the only form of action that mattered. She took a deep breath, finally, breaking the silence. I think I've been asking the wrong questions," she admitted, her voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. "I came into this interview thinking you had to be a certain way, say the right things, be the outspoken advocate. But you're right, Keanu. Maybe the quiet actions, the things we do when no one's watching, are the real way to make a difference." Keanu smiled, a soft, knowing smile, as if he had been waiting for her to reach this conclusion all along. "It's not about being perfect, Sarah. It's about being authentic. And sometimes authenticity doesn't require grand gestures. It just requires consistency in our actions, day in and day out." There was a pause, but this time it wasn't awkward. It felt like a moment of clarity between the two of them. The audience was still, listening intently as the energy in the room shifted. The conversation had gone from a fiery debate to a quiet reflection, and in that shift, both Sarah and Keanu had revealed something deeper about themselves. Sarah's mind was spinning with everything she had just learned. She had expected to walk away with a story, an angle to report, but instead she had gained a new perspective. It wasn't about forcing a celebrity to conform to society's expectations. It was about understanding the complexities of their actions and perhaps realizing that silence wasn't always the enemy. Keanu had always been a man of action, but now she understood what that meant. His activism didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be a hashtag or a viral video. It needed to be authentic, and authenticity didn't need to be validated by the masses. It just needed to be lived. Finally, Sarah looked at him with newfound respect. "I didn't expect this to turn into a philosophy lesson, but I have to admit, I've learned a lot today." Keanu gave a small chuckle. "It wasn't my intention to turn it into one, but sometimes we all need to step back and think about why we do the things we do." At that moment, Sarah realized something crucial. In her attempt to challenge Keanu's activism, she had overlooked the most important question of all. It wasn't whether Keanu was speaking out on social issues, it was whether he was living in a way that truly made a difference. And in that, Keanu had won her respect without uttering a single word of protest. The interview had turned into something unexpected, but in the process, it had revealed something more profound than either of them could have predicted. Keanu has certainly left us with a lot to think about. Do you believe that actions speak louder than words? Or do you think celebrities have an obligation to be more vocal? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. This conversation is far from over. As the interview continued, Sarah Mitchell felt a shift in herself. The edge she had carried with her earlier had softened. She was no longer looking for a headline, a soundbite that would shake the world. Instead, she was now looking for something deeper, something more human. Keanu had broken through her defenses in a way she hadn't anticipated. In that brief moment of shared understanding, she had begun to realize something significant. Keanu's power wasn't just in his ability to act, to perform on screen. His real strength lay in his quiet, deliberate choices, in the way he approached life. His resistance to the typical celebrity culture of self-promotion and loud activism had forced Sarah to reflect on her own career, her own life choices, and the impact she had made on the world. The studio lights seemed to dim slightly as the gravity of the conversation settled around them. Keanu, who had always been a private figure, had opened up in a way few had ever witnessed. The emotional honesty between them was palpable, and Sarah knew that this was a turning point, not just for the interview, but for herself. But there was one more question she had to ask. Something had been bothering her, a lingering thought she couldn't shake. She looked at Keanu, her eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and sincerity. "Keanu," she began, her voice softer now, "you've shared so much about your perspective on activism, silence, and authenticity. But there's something I've been wondering. Do you ever feel lonely? I mean, with all that you've been through, with the pain and loss in your life, do you ever find yourself wishing you could just connect with others in a way that's more open, more vulnerable?" For the first time in the interview, Keanu paused. His gaze shifted slightly, as though he was searching for the right words. It was a rare moment of hesitation for him, and it didn't go unnoticed by Sarah. She knew that this wasn't just a question about his public persona, it was about his inner world, the part of him that only a few had glimpsed. Keanu exhaled, slowly, a slight furrow in his brow. "Loneliness is a funny thing," he said, his voice thoughtful. "It's something everyone experiences, no matter how many people are around you. But in a way, I think it's a necessary part of life. Loneliness forces you to look inward, to ask yourself the tough questions. It's in those moments that I find clarity, that I understand myself a little more. And when you know yourself, truly know yourself, the loneliness doesn't feel as heavy." His words were heavy with meaning, and Sarah found herself absorbing them with a deep sense of empathy. She had assumed that someone like Keanu, with all his success, fame, and adoration, would have everything he needed. But in that moment she realized that even the most beloved figures in the world faced the same struggles, the same existential questions that everyone else did. "I think everyone's afraid of loneliness," he continued, his voice quieter now. "But it doesn't have to be a bad thing. In fact, it can be one of the most powerful tools for growth. I don't need to be surrounded by people all the time to feel connected. It's about the quality of those connections, not the quantity. And sometimes the people who truly matter are the ones who understand the silence between words." Sarah nodded, absorbing his insight. For the first time, she understood the depth of Keanu's character. He wasn't just a figure in the public eye. He was a man who had experienced profound loss, who had learned to embrace his solitude, and who had cultivated a quiet strength that transcended his fame. The audience, which had been quietly observing the interview, seemed to sense the shift in energy. The tension that had filled the room earlier was gone. There was no longer any sense of conflict between Sarah and Keanu. Instead, they were both in a moment of shared understanding, two people, looking at life through different lenses, but seeing the same truths. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his expression softening, as though he had shared something deeply personal. "It's not about avoiding loneliness," he said with a gentle smile. "It's about learning how to be okay with it. And if you can do that, if you can truly be at peace with your own company, Then you start to realize that you don't need the outside world to validate you. You can just be. The simplicity of his statement hit Sarah harder than any complex argument or impassioned speech ever could. She had spent years chasing validation, from her viewers, from her colleagues, from the world. But here was Keanu, someone who had found peace in silence, in solitude, in accepting that he didn't need to be constantly in the spotlight to feel fulfilled. Sarah sat in silence for a long moment, allowing his words to sink in. The interview had shifted from a battle of ideals to a dialogue about the human condition. Keanu's vulnerability, his willingness to embrace his inner world, had stripped away any pretense. This was no longer about the narrative she had set up. This was about truth. She finally spoke, her voice quieter now, filled with a new understanding. Keanu, I think I came into this interview wanting to find something to challenge you on, but now I feel like I've learned more from you than I ever expected. Keanu smiled, that familiar warmth returning to his face. I think we all have something to learn from each other, Sarah. No one has all the answers. We just keep figuring it out one step at a time. For the first time in this interview, Sarah wasn't trying to capture a moment, to get a soundbite. She was simply present. She understood now not just what Keanu was about, but the essence of his philosophy. It wasn't about being loud, or even about being seen. It was about living authentically, connecting meaningfully, and understanding that the greatest form of activism was leading by example, quietly, with purpose, and with compassion. The camera crew prepared to wrap up. Sarah turned to Keanu with a newfound respect. Thank you for sharing this with me today. I think we've both learned something important. Keanu nodded, his smile gentle and knowing. It's been my pleasure, Sarah. Keanu's wisdom is undeniable, but what do you think? Is loneliness truly a tool for growth, or should we fight against it? How do you handle silence in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments and make sure to hit that subscribe button. The journey we're on together is just getting started. The interview had drawn to a close, but Sarah Mitchell knew that something profound had just happened. The conversation with Keanu had shifted from a typical celebrity chat to something far deeper. He had revealed layers of himself that few had seen before. And in doing so, he had inadvertently shifted Sarah's entire perspective on what it meant to lead a meaningful life. As the crew packed up, Sarah sat in her chair, replaying the moments in her mind. Keanu had not only shut down her initial approach to celebrity activism, but he had also illuminated an entirely new path. His quiet strength, his ability to remain grounded in the face of overwhelming pressure, was a powerful reminder that activism didn't always need to be loud or performative. To make a significant impact, Keanu's words echoed in her mind. It's not about being seen. It's about being authentic. There was so much truth in that simple statement. Maybe Sarah had been wrong all along. Perhaps, in her pursuit of getting the most clickable interview, she had overlooked what really mattered, the internal work that shapes a person's life and choices. As the studio lights dimmed and the team began to exit, Sarah stood and walked toward Keanu, who was gathering his belongings. She felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. This interview had been one of the most eye-opening experiences of her career, and she wasn't sure if she could have fully processed it without the quiet reflection that had taken place between them. Keanu, Sarah began, her voice filled with a deep respect. I just want to thank you again for everything. This interview has changed the way I see things. It's not often you get to experience something so personal and real on this kind of platform. Keanu looked up, his gentle smile never wavering. Thank you for listening, Sarah. It's easy to assume that people like me have all the answers, or that we need to be something for others. But the truth is, none of us have it all figured out. We're just doing our best, trying to stay true to who we are. His words once again felt like a quiet bombshell. This wasn't a man who had figured it all out. He was just as human as anyone else, struggling with the same doubts, fears, and complexities of life. The only difference was that he had learned to accept those parts of himself. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up? Sarah asked, almost as if she was trying to find a final nugget of wisdom. Keanu paused for a moment, his gaze far away, as though he were searching for something beyond the present moment. Then he turned to her, and with the calmness that had characterized their entire conversation, he said, "I think the biggest lesson I've learned is that life doesn't require us to be perfect. It just asks us to show up, to be present, and to do our best with what we have. It's about trying to make the world a little better with each small action, even if no one notices." There it was, the answer Sarah had been unknowingly seeking. Keanu's authenticity wasn't defined by grand gestures or social media posts. It wasn't defined by being loud or having a platform. It was defined by how he lived, by how he made choices that were true to himself, no matter the expectations placed on him. The room had grown quiet, and Sarah felt that familiar weight of realization settling in once more. She was no longer focused on finding the perfect angle, the perfect quote. She was simply moved by the realization that true change, true power, was quiet, sometimes silent. It was in the small moments, the choices that no one saw but that meant everything in shaping a life. "Thank you, Keanu," Sarah said again, this time with a soft smile of her own, "for reminding me that there's more to life than just the noise, that the quiet moments, the ones that don't get attention, are just as important as the loud ones." Keanu gave her a knowing look, his eyes warm and kind. "It's been my pleasure. And remember, the quiet moments, they're often where the real change happens." As Sarah left the studio that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had shifted in her. She had come to this interview looking for a story, looking for an angle to criticize or challenge, but instead, she had found something much more valuable: the realization that the loudest voices don't always make the most impact. Sometimes it's the quiet, the stillness, and the authentic moments that make the most difference. The world wasn't going to change because of the loudest voices on social media or the most sensational headlines. It would change through the actions of people who were quietly, consistently living their truth. And those were the people like Keanu who would leave a lasting legacy, not because of their fame or their platform, but because of their unwavering commitment to being real. As the door to the studio closed behind her, Sarah knew that this interview, this conversation, had left an indelible mark on her. And in the coming days, she would carry Keanu's words with her, applying them to her own life and to the way she approached the world. Keanu's reflections have given us all a lot to think about. But what do you think? Do you believe that quiet actions can have a greater impact than loud ones? Or do you think it's essential to speak out to make a difference? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because this journey of self-discovery and learning isn't over yet. As Sarah Mitchell sat at her desk the following week, the interview with Keanu Reeves had already started to ripple through the world. What began as just another celebrity interview had turned into something far greater. The video had gone viral, but not for the reasons Sarah had expected. People weren't sharing it because of sensational headlines or controversy. They were sharing it because Keanu had sparked something deep within them. His words, his calm and introspective nature, had struck a chord with viewers who had long been craving something more real, more human, in a world filled with noise and drama. Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how one conversation had changed the trajectory of her career and her life. The comments under the video were filled with heartfelt messages from people thanking Keanu for his wisdom and for showing them a different path. It seemed that he had done the very thing Sarah had hoped to do. He had made an impact that mattered, but in a quiet, profound way. For the first time in her career, Sarah felt like she wasn't just doing a job for the sake of entertainment or ratings. She felt a sense of purpose, knowing that she had been a part of a conversation that had touched the lives of so many. She had been a vessel, not for her own agenda, but for the quiet revolution that Keanu had started with his words. As Sarah scrolled through the comments, one stood out to her. It was a simple message, written by a viewer who had clearly been moved by the conversation. "Keanu reminded me that being quiet doesn't mean being invisible. Sometimes the smallest actions speak the loudest. I'm going to try and live more authentically starting today." Her heart swelled with emotion as she read it. This was the ripple effect she had been hoping for, the true power of the interview. It wasn't just about sensationalism or controversy. It was about starting a conversation that encouraged people to look inward, to re-examine the way they approached life, and to find their own quiet strength. Sarah leaned back in her chair and sighed, the weight of the past few days settling on her. It hadn't been easy to let go of the narrative she had planned for the interview. It hadn't been easy to let go of the pressure to deliver something that would generate headlines. But in doing so, she had uncovered something far more valuable. Authenticity. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her producer, Alex. The message was short but to the point. We've received an overwhelming amount of feedback from the Keanu interview. People are asking for more of these kinds of conversations. They want depth, authenticity, not just the usual celebrity fluff. Can we make this a regular segment? Sarah's fingers hovered over her phone screen. The question hung in the air. Could she continue to create interviews like this? Interviews that didn't seek to create conflict but instead encouraged introspection and self-growth. Could she continue to push her own boundaries and bring something new to the table? Something that was authentic, real, and meaningful. She thought about Keanu's words, about his perspective on life and activism. She thought about how his response had completely upended her expectations of what an interview could be. Maybe, just maybe, this was the direction she needed to go in. Maybe this was the beginning of a new chapter in her career, one where she wasn't just a journalist, but a storyteller, someone who could bring light to the voices and perspectives that weren't always heard. With a deep breath, Sarah responded to Alex's message. Yes, let's make it happen. We'll find a way to keep this going. And just like that, a new path was set before her. The format would change, the stories would evolve, but the core of it would remain the same: authenticity. The ripple effect of Keanu's words had planted a seed, and now it was time to nurture it to see where it could go. Weeks passed, and Sarah's new segment, Real Talk with Sarah Mitchell, became an unexpected success. People tuned in not for the usual celebrity gossip or scandalous moments, but because they wanted something real. They wanted to hear stories that weren't sugar-coated or manufactured. They wanted conversations that were raw, emotional, and introspective. Conversations that, like Keanu's, might not make the loudest noise but would resonate deeply in the hearts of those who watched. Through these new interviews, Sarah found herself connecting with people in a way she never had before. She interviewed activists, authors, psychologists, and everyday heroes, people whose stories had the power to inspire and challenge. And in each of these conversations, she saw more clearly that real change often starts with quiet acts of courage, with the decision to show up authentically, no matter the noise around you. But perhaps the most profound shift was within Sarah herself. She had gone from a journalist seeking the next big story, the next viral headline, to someone who sought to uncover the deeper truths behind the people she interviewed. She had learned that the most impactful moments in life weren't always the ones with the most attention or fanfare. Sometimes the quiet moments, like the one she shared with Keanu, were the ones that left the deepest impression. The ripple effect of that interview had spread far beyond the studio. It had ignited a movement, however small, of people striving to live more authentically. And Sarah, in her own way, had become a part of that movement, a reminder that even in a world obsessed with noise and visibility, authenticity could still find its place. The interview with Keanu Reeves changed everything, not just for Sarah, but for all of us. What has been the biggest takeaway for you? How do you plan to incorporate authenticity into your life moving forward? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, hit that subscribe button to keep following this journey of growth, change, and connection.